Muito boa tarde para todos. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another session, our eighth session of the Luso-American Education Foundation Conference, the 45th conference of the Luso-American Education Foundation, began in the 1970s as a product of bilingual education in the state of California. At that time, we had a history of students arriving from Portugal, mainly from the archipelago of the Azores, who had been here very recent, and of course needed all of the services, including bilingual education. Soon after that, bilingual education took a hit in California for various reasons, and also the community began to change immensely. Our immigration ceased at the latter part of the 1970s, early 1980s, and so the conference itself began to change in the end of the 1980s as well, but we have continued with it, the Luso-American Education Foundation Conference, and this year being hosted second time in a row by the Portuguese Beyond Borders Institute from California State University of Fresno. We are very excited about this presentation, and so we want to thank Benjamin Chaffin for his work on the Portuguese experience in Hawaii. And so first and foremost, welcome, Ben. Thank you so much for your research. Thank you for sharing it with us here in the Portuguese Beyond Borders Institute at Fresno State and through the Luso-American Education Foundation. And if we can start before you begin your presentation, which as again I said, we're looking forward to it. Thanks to all who are joining here, and thanks to one big thanks also to Televisão Portuguesa de Califórnia, TVP, from California, the Portuguese television programming by João Manuel Dias, who is also live streaming this event as well, and all the different platforms that we are on. And of course, as all of you know, will be archived, the presentation, as all of our conference will be archived at the Henry Madden Library as part of the Portuguese oral history project that we are doing at Fresno State. Ben, welcome to Fresno via virtually, and I believe you're in Santa Barbara, so it's a little bit nicer than Fresno in a lot of ways, you know. But welcome to Fresno virtually. Hopefully someday we can have you here live.
Absolutely, my pleasure. Glad to be here.
And if you can tell us a little bit about yourself before you begin and how you chose this project, if you don't mind.
Sure thing. I want to start off first by thanking the Luso-American Education Foundation, Portuguese Beyond Borders, Fresno State, and of course, Professor Borges for the opportunity to address this topic and participate in this conference for the first time. I wanted to mention and thank as well Professor Correia de Sá, who unfortunately could not be here today. So this is a labor of love for me, having been born and raised in Hawaii. My academic background is on literature in English and literature from South America, where I lived and taught and fell in love with the Portuguese language. And my focus as a graduate student is on literature from Brazil. So it's with some trepidation that I venture into these areas, all the while aware of the impressive history of the UCSB department. And obviously I welcome feedback as well as a dialogue. So, I think this central picture here from Felix and Senecal's book, it's a seminal book from 1978, The Portuguese in Hawaii, and they have a few pictures here from the Hawaii State Archives. I think this one in the middle is an apropos metaphor to launch into this talk. It gives a glimpse of how Azorean and Madeiran immigrants experienced plantation life at the end of the 19th century and early 20th century, pioneering through challenging conditions, the emphasis put on the strength of the family unit here, the form of the oven as a focal point of unity and community, the idea of continuing tradition and the creation and labor of something new, as well as an eventual impact on mainstream Hawaii of the 20th century, an impact on Hawaii cuisine with the bread, what is typically thought of as bread from Hawaii is in effect an adaptation of Portuguese bread. So in that sense, I think it's an apt metaphor. My talk is divided up into three parts. First, I wanted to give a rudimentary overview of the history of the Portuguese in the Hawaiian Islands. Second, I want to give examples of Portuguese culture shaping the burgeoning multicultural mainstream that arises in the 20th century in Hawaii. And this is my operational inquiry, so to speak. If Portuguese food, language, music, etc., have greatly shaped what is thought of as mainstream Hawaii today, to what extent has it shaped the Hawaii intellectual and literary tradition? Lastly, in the third part of the presentation, I want to turn to a University of Hawaii professor of Madeiran descent, one of the most notable novelists of the 20th century, and explore how he dialogues with elements from the Lusíadas, revisiting and trying to make sense of the inheritance of the initial European contact with the indigenous Hawaiian people, the Kanaka Maoli, and the death of Captain James Cook. And since this talk in part has to do with exploration, I thought we could start from there. Felix, Seneca, and Nunes put forward in two different books, put forward the provocative idea that possibly the Portuguese navigator João Gaetano, sailing in the service of the Spanish crown, may have actually been the first European to encounter and map the Hawaiian Islands in 1542. Alas, I haven't seen this corroborated anywhere else, but I have seen it argued that given the large traffic over in the Age of Discovery over these centuries in the Pacific, that it's improbable that the islands hadn't been spotted or mapped somehow for the arrival of Cook at the end of the 18th century. And I have here a map from the Trans-Pacific Project in which they map out the routes of different explorers dating back to Magellan. And you can see how the Hawaiian Islands are up here to the north. And you can see how the routes wrap around the Hawaiian Islands. So we have Cook's first arrival in 1778, depicted here on the cover of Bushnell's novel, The Return of Lono. And we have the arrival of the first Portuguese sailors on the Eleanor in 1790. And then the establishment of the Hawaiian Kingdom by Kamehameha the Great in 1795, the consolidation with Hawaii and Niihau, the final islands, composing the full Hawaiian Kingdom in 1810. So if we consider this period of the Hawaiian Kingdom leading up to 1878 and what is sometimes called the Great Immigration to the Hawaiian Islands, we see early immigrants from the Portuguese territories establishing themselves in occupational areas where they'll have a substantial presence deep into the 20th century, if not still today. And I think you'll see clear parallels to other parts of the diaspora. Here up top, you have Paniolos or Hawaiian cowboys taking cattle out to the ships through water as the practice was done. The Portuguese established themselves early on in ranching alongside Hawaiians and Mexican vaqueros recruited by Kamehameha III in the 1830s, forming an integral part of Hawaii's Paniolo or cowboy culture. And they also established themselves in dairy. I have here Sousa Dairy Park, the Sousa Dairy Park sign. It's an example that just happened during COVID. It's a park in my hometown of Kaneohe that was officially renamed Sousa Dairy Park, Sousa as it's pronounced in the US, in the English-speaking US, to honor the Sousa family that had a dairy there into at least the middle of the 20th century. And you can actually see footage of rodeo events that were put on, different festivals on YouTube. It's also clear that some Portuguese whalers and sailors stayed on after arriving in Hawaii, and among them some of Black or part Black Cabo Verdeans. And some recent work has been done on this, including Professor Sharma at Northwestern. Nordyke reports that these sailors primarily married ethnically Hawaiian brides, their families then identifying themselves as Portuguese or part Hawaiian. In a 2011 article, Nelly Naupaka Andrade and Stephanie Nishimura touch on how the breakthrough of genetic testing has allowed local families to trace their African roots that came through Cabo Verde. And finally, and most importantly, here in the middle, the sugar plantation began in this era. Sugarcane was brought by the native Hawaiian people on their arrival to the islands. And among the pioneers of the early 19th century production was an owner on Maui of Portuguese descent. His name appears in different variations in the records, but is generally considered to be Antonio Silva. A couple sources ballpark his arrival to Maui as being in the late 1820s, although I would imagine production was actually later than that. While sugar production will be consolidated into oligopolies connected to the descendants of American missionaries over the next few decades, the large part of the Portuguese experience in Hawaii does revolve around the sugar industry. So the story is this: David Kalakaua is elected king by the legislature in 1874. He is a Renaissance man, a musician, a composer, in many ways a champion for Native Hawaiian rights, culture, and history. At the beginning of his reign, he visits Ulysses S. Grant to negotiate the Reciprocity Treaty of 1875, which eliminates tariffs on different Hawaiian agricultural products entering the US. Most importantly, sugarcane, which is going to lead to a huge sugar boom. As the Reciprocity Treaty takes effect in 1876, there's a sudden huge demand for labor. The Portuguese consular agent in Hawaii, Jason Perry, born Jacinto Pereira in the Azores, goes to the Hawaii Planters Society and suggests that the kingdom draw on labor from the Azores and Madeira, which were already seeing an exodus to other parts of the world, including those with sugar production. Sugar cultivation in Madeira at this time had already existed for 450 years, and you can see in old interviews, Madeiran immigrants drawing a comparison between the geography and the landscape of Hawaii and Madeira. Senecal and Felix report that the Hawaii Immigration Board first creates terms, and they'll subsequently vary, in which the Hawaiian government pays for passage and guaranteed work with a salary of $15 a month. So then the first of several ships arrives from Funchal in 1878 with 469 immigrants from Madeira and Cabo Verde. Kalakaua visits Portugal in 1881 and reaches an agreement that secures the continued flow of labor. Cristiana Bastos, in her excellent article, Portuguese in the Cane, the Racialization of Labor in Hawaii Plantations, puts the number of Portuguese immigrants in this time period from 1878 to 1913 at approximately 24,000. These were primarily from the Azores and Madeira, but increasingly from mainland Portugal and Spain in the last few years of this period. So I put together here a simple timeline of when different waves of this immigration initiated in Hawaii, based primarily on Jeff Siegel's numbers, to present a kind of a global idea of how the Portuguese fit into this giant boom in the foreign population. Returning to the contracts offered the Portuguese, they are a three-year work commitment. While there is some limited permeability in parts of the strata of the plantation, Portuguese, along with Norwegian, German, Scottish, and Native Hawaiians, become associated with lower management and in particular, the role of Luna or foreman. In the Portuguese community, there's some movement to and from California and New England, particularly after Hawaii becomes a US territory. And in the early 20th century, there's even an effort to recruit Portuguese pioneers, settlers to Timor-Leste, to to act as labor there. But the overall narrative of the Portuguese is one in which after the 3-year contract is up, in the words of Senecal and Felix, the Portuguese make up, quote, the backbone of the small farmer class. And so you can see here an initial immigration from China. Kalakaua looks to other Pacific islands to provide labor in Hawaii. And then with Jason Perry's idea, you see this large influx of Portuguese immigrants, and then the beginning of the subsequent waves here. I'm emphasizing this partly because it connects to O.A. Bushnell's novel, but returning to the Reciprocity Treaty, what may have seemed an economic advantage for the Hawaiian Kingdom at the time sets in motion a chain of events in which empowered businessmen of American, British, and German background engineer the eventual overthrow of the Hawaiian government in 1893 and the eventual annexation of Hawaii to the US in 1898. What then rises out of that in the 20th century is a multicultural society haunted by a major tragedy of the Native Hawaiian people, a model of outsider and usurper in which movements are at work to restore and protect indigenous culture and language, and a model of modern Hawaii. And one model is a modern Hawaii that is overwhelmingly complex, multicultural, and stemmed from these events at the turn of the century. So these ideas of a kind of reconciliation of two novels that are often difficult to distinguish from each other. So I'll return to that idea with the novel, but I want to address the society forming as a consequence of the sugar boom first. So Portuguese immigration increases in the 1880s and 1890s, and as elsewhere, religious and cultural societies, partially enumerated by Bostus, spring up, some of which still exist today, continuing festivals and traditions, as well as a variety of Portuguese language newspapers. And they're really interesting articles. You can read articles in Portuguese about the overthrow of the Hawaiian government and opinion pieces that reflect the kind of the organizational elements of the community and the self-image of the community. And these are available in different places, but also at the University of Hawaii Library. At the same time, you can see here, this is working off of Jeff Siegel's numbers. I've taken data from the 1920 census, in which the overall population is approximately 250,000. And you can see how you have this multi-ethnic landscape, and that the Portuguese are one of the largest ethnic groups at the time. ESTEP in 1974 shows the presence of the Portuguese across different professions in the early 20th century, including as teachers in the classroom. And Senecal and Felix point out the Portuguese presence in the territorial government at the turn of the century. And Jason Perry, the consul who started this immigration process, his son, Antonio, will become Chief Justice at one point. Alongside important projects of preservation, this Azorian, Madeiran, and mainland Portuguese presence becomes a major factor in shaping the mainstream culture of 20th century. And there it is. And again, I think bread functions as an apt metaphor as Azorian and Madeiran sweetbread gets adapted and altered, embraced as staples by the mainstream, a food that carries with it a Hawaii identity, a comfort food, if you will. Here I have King's brand of Hawaiian sweetbread, which stems from Portuguese sweetbread. Considering then the impact of Portuguese cuisine in the 20th century, there are a variety of individual dishes or foods that are transformations of originally Azorian and Madeiran dishes, which would hold that same status as a kind of comfort food or food strongly embraced by the entire population. So I put up here to the left what we would call Portuguese sausage, which would commonly be eaten at breakfast. You have Leonard's Bakery. This is a famous sign on Kapuhulu in Honolulu that it was established by a Portuguese family. You can see the sign still says Pão Doce. We have the kind of Hawaii alteration, which we call of the original dish, which we call Portuguese bean soup. And the diner down the street where I grew up will serve you, does not have a particularly Portuguese past, but they'll serve you pork, they'll serve you vinho d'alhos. It's one of the main items on the menu. And then of course, malasadas from Hawaii, which are another staple. Beyond specific dishes, the argument made in Felix and Senecal's book is that Portuguese cuisine actually brought flavor. It sort of reimagined overall Hawaii cuisine, bringing a kind of, it sort of unfairly portrays Hawaiian cuisine as bland, but this idea is important of it sort of permeating beyond one dish, right? Likewise, we see a large impact on music. Felix Nunes and Senecal traced the origins of the ukulele to the arrival of the second ship from Madeira in 1879. Augusto Dias, José do Espírito Santo, and Manuel Nunes are three immigrants on this ship, the Ravenscrag, that will adopt the Mochecho Braguinha, becoming popularly recognized ukulele craftsmen. And ukulele in Hawaiian is a word that reflects the motion of the hands, the frenetic action of the hands, jumping fleet, basically, right? This coincides with King Kalakaua, who again is a composer lifting the ban on hula, and there's this resurgence in native Hawaiian culture. The story in Felix and Senecal is that Augusto Dias would go to the royal residence, Iolani Palace, and give the king ukulele lessons. And so Portuguese influences are prevalent there as contemporary hula evolves. It is also an important influence in Hawaiian slack key, in the Hawaiian slack key guitar tradition. Sonny Chillingworth here on the left is one of the slack key greats from Hawaii. And the story is that he learned this song, Chamarita with one R, like that, Malasada's Portuguese folk song, from Azorian immigrants on a plantation, a Molokai, and then he presented the song with his title that has these kind of Portuguese catchwords that would be identifiable within Hawaii culture. He releases that song first in the early 60s, and a few of the Portuguese words are still recognizable, although for the most part, he's just trying to recreate a vocal sound that might fit the context. And then in this release, which is that I'm thinking of here, which is off of Sunny Solo, and it's him and the guitar, it does sound much more kind of like modern slack key, and the years have gone by, and the remnants of Portuguese have more or less disappeared, and yet the tune itself exists, and in a way has been assimilated into the Hawaiian slack key sensibility. You know, in a wonderful example of the multi-directionality of adaptation and synthesis and culture, the artist Makana, who studied under Chillingworth, is reported to have consulted the Hawaii Council on Portuguese Heritage in Kalihi in Honolulu, and asked for help restoring the Portuguese lyrics. He releases this album around 2002, I think. And so he renames the song Fado because it is actually a fado. And they sort of come up with words that are sort of that fit the situation, and it's an interesting experience to listen to his song within that kind of Hawaiian slack key and fusion tradition, and compare it with this is a wonderful example from a site called Memoria Media, which kind of catalogs these sorts of things. It has Alcino Teles do Fundo singing the song. He's from, this is in Bragança in northern Portugal, right? So it's a wonderful way of kind of conceptualizing the diaspora. If you think of many people exiting northern Portugal, arriving to the archipelagos in the Atlantic, and then eventually arriving in Hawaii, and then comparing this reimagined Hawaiian song with this sort of traditional folk tune in northern Portugal. Speaking of language, the Portuguese, given the size of the community, their role as foreman and a focal point of communication on the plantation, did have a large impact on Pidgin, more formally known as Hawaii Creole English, the language of communication that arose among all the subcultures of Hawaii amidst these waves of immigration. It's a language that is a mixture of, among others, English, Hawaiian, Japanese, and Portuguese. And you can see here an ad for Shakespeare adapted into Pidgin and performed in Honolulu. Seagulls is one of the best articles on this, and I need to preface this by saying that I'm not a linguist, but it seems to me that there are clearly compelling examples of Portuguese shaping Hawaii Creole English. For example, the common usage of stay instead of to be as a substitution for the to be verb, like where you stay, and where are you, this idea. And the idea is that that possibly phonetically came from estar in Portuguese, to be, or lexically from ficar, right? So using stay in sort of a different way than you would commonly in English, depending on, and all this sort of obviously depends on the various situations. And that strikes me, that's an example that strikes me as the most plausible explanation for that within HCE, Hawaiian Creole English. There are also a few bad words which have morphed, imported into Hawaii Creole English, which I'll skip here. But if you'll permit me the vulgarity, I think shishi is a good example of how the word shishi is a good example of how it becomes difficult to distinguish and make out the different influences of substrates in HCE. You can imagine speakers of other languages learning the word to communicate, say, a break with a foreman, or somehow the use of the word with a school teacher, but there's also the word shishi in Japanese. And so it becomes difficult to discern where it came from and how they might have blended together. This is it's a very difficult, the influence is undoubtable, but the process is difficult to sort of parse out. I've heard it said on more than one occasion that HCE is beyond English, draws from vocabulary of a variety of languages and largely uses Portuguese grammar. Actually, someone teaching a high school course on HCE said this to me once. And again, I'm not a linguist, but I do think that that Portuguese grammar is very limited. Siegel, for example, presents smaller aspects of the grammar, which we might be able to distinguish from universal phenomena of Creoles, going beyond simply a kind of phenomena like lack of conjugation, this sort of thing. And one of his examples is the infinitivo pessoal, this use of the infinitive that would be specific to Portuguese. But in truth, I'm not entirely convinced by his examples. And while I welcome it certainly as an idea, as a possibility, it seems I'm not convinced, let's say. And what strikes me as even more difficult to sort of figure out is how prosody was shaped by Portuguese and other languages though one, of course, assumes some impact. If there's an intonation, say, particular to HCE, is it coming from Hawaiian, or is it coming from Portuguese, or is it coming from somewhere else? This sort of idea. So speaking of language, my supposition is that a parallel to this influence of cuisine, music, etc. on mainstream Hawaii culture likely exists in literature and the humanities. The first papers on literature in English from the Portuguese community appeared in the late 70s with Francis M. Rogers' work on US writers of Portuguese descent. In his survey, he identifies the novel How We Come Back from 1975 by James Carvalho and Hawaii's Kohala Breezes by Elvira Osorio Roll as two examples from Hawaii. Both Rogers and Bastos look beyond its literary aspects, Osorio Roll's novel, to celebrate the social and historical significance that it communicates. Bastos sums up its importance as follows, and I quote from page 85. Its dense and multi-layered account of the life of the Portuguese in Hawaii further enables us to pursue an analysis of the interactions of class, race, and gender in that society. Bastos begins the article that I referenced, Portuguese in the Cane, drawing a parallel between the Portuguese migration to Hawaii and Os Lusíadas. The myth, the power of the Lusíadas, if seemingly passed on orally, appears in testimonials in Hawaii. Take, for example, Margaret Araújo's story, Vovó, Who Are the Portuguese, from 1975, in which the grandmother explains that, quote, Portuguese can be found everywhere in the world. Ah, minha filha. What stories of bravery and adventure. Luís Vaz de Camões, the Portuguese poet, wrote an epic history of Portugal and her discoveries and explorations called Os Lusíadas, which is a triumph of literature. And to cement that parallel, this kind of using the myth of the Lusíadas in the Hawaii context, I've got a mirror-like presentation of the two voyages here. Vasco da Gama, you see him going southward around the southern edge of Africa up toward India. And then we have a kind of mirrored or inverse journey that will be taken from the Atlantic around the bottom of South America going up to Hawaii. In 1991, Stephen Sumida, in his survey of Hawaii literature in English, touches on The Return of Lono, a 1956 historical novel by one of the larger and influential literary figures of 20th century Hawaii, O.A. Bushnell. Bushnell's grandmother was from Madeira, and Sumida, who like Bushnell taught at the University of Hawaii, observes that Bushnell as a child would attend local meetings of the Portuguese Society with his father, and he wonders how much Os Lusíadas shaped one of the notable novels of 20th century Hawaii. So Bushnell trained as a microbiologist on the mainland. He joined the Army for World War II, excuse me, and then he returned to teach for many years at the University of Hawaii, where he wrote historical novels in English. The Return of Lono, a novel of Captain Cook's voyage, is his first effort in '56, and it won him the Atlantic Monthly Fiction Prize. I'll leave a more comprehensive literary analysis of the whole book for another time. Suffice it to say, it is written as a historical naval fiction, with the drama and tension primarily arising from dialogue amongst the crew and in missteps with the native Hawaiian population. Bushnell's book dramatizes the third voyage of Cook and his quest, again, this exploratory idea of finding passages, his quest to find a Northwest Passage for trade around North America. He arrives in the novel in 1779 to the Big Island of Hawaii during the Makahiki season, a multi-month festival that has qualities of carnival, and is received as Lono, the god of this festival. And part of that is the sails and masts of this ship are reminiscent of structures associated with the festival. After a stay, the Resolution and Discovery, the two ships then leave, headed for Alaska and further northern exploration. They return after a storm, a mast broken, when the Makahiki season has ended. Cook is eventually killed there, trying to kidnap and ransom the chief Kalani'ohu'u for the return of his ship's small boat. So, in Camoins' Viagem Iniciática, the Camoins and the initiating journey, Elder Macedo focuses on the sobejo atrevimento, the audacious daring, the affront, this idea of almost like a kind of, in classical terms, like a kind of hubris, right? He focuses on it in terms of Bacchus, which appears in the Lusíadas, and the monster coming up out of sea, Adamastor. This idea is captured in the parallel made by the Old Man of Belém, in Portuguese it's O Velho do Restelo, as the crew leaves Lisbon in Canto 4. So Prometheus stole the fire from heaven, which rages in every human heart, setting the world ablaze with arms, with death and dishonor, and all for nothing. How much better for us, Prometheus, how much less harmful for the world, had you not breathed into your famous statue the restlessness that goads mankind to match you. Bushnell portrays his cook as a Prometheus, titling one of his chapters, Prometheus of the Pacific. And from that chapter, I have the following passage. In that instant, and this is the narrator speaking, who's also the interpreter, John Forrest. In that instant, I knew what the sufferings of Prometheus must have been. And I was shaken by a storm of wonderment and sorrow, for here was an unhappy man who should have been happy. Here was England's hero, her greatest explorer in geography, a man of science honored by his peers, a man of humanity beloved of his friends and his crews, a great man destined for high places. He was a captain notable for his achievements by which he had set limits to the vast Pacific Sea, bounding it with the ancient accepted continents, dotting it with numerous islands of his discovery, bearing the light of knowledge into the dark corners of man's earth from the perspective of the British crew. In assuming the role of Lono, Cook becomes Prometheus, Titan, stealing fire from the gods, playing God, so to speak. But the discord of the crew corrupts and harnesses New English Calvinistic rhetoric to eventually condemn Cook as Lucifer. Returning to this idea of Adamastor, this colossus that comes out of the sea to challenge the daring of Vasco da Gama as he tries to make it around Africa. There's an interesting moment in Bushnell's novel where he presents a scene in which the British crew is dying and a large statue of Ku, the god of war, which is being taken in a skiff to the main ship for firewood, appears to be coming up out of the waves in the night toward them. And Cook will eventually lash it to the deck of the ship, and it operates as a symbol for their inability to find the Northwest Passage and a context in which they're forced to return to the Big Island. Bushnell builds on the place name Kealakekua, where the landing happens, which in Hawaiian means the path of the gods, to populate this world with religious and mythical figures, but he does it in a surprisingly anachronistic way. While other novels that seek to be foundational for a culture, like, say, Joyce's Ulysses, dialogue with the classical, Bushnell's is far more reminiscent of Camoins and a Neoplatonic project of the 16th century. He lays a foundation with references or allusions to classical mythology and gods, Eros, Charon, Bacchus, Satyrs, but using them to create a stage where different cosmologies can coexist. And separate in his narrative from the manipulation and power connected to Hawaiian and British American Protestant cultures and societies. The book too seems that it might have adapted some of the themes, creating what would be in effect the strange corruption of the Ilha dos Amores, the island of love, as onshore sailors are lost in a night of love and a haze of classical references. The crew's interpreter and narrator of the story, Forrest, in a real dynamic, calls them, quote, the God-intoxicated women of Kealakekua. Though it's not only, though it's only when Forrest, falling for Hina Hina, the daughter of the priest of Lono, when he confesses that he's human, he's not a god to her father, it's only then that he can pursue authentic love. I think back to the endeavor, the task of writing a foundational novel, this idea of the great Hawaiian novel of the 20th century. And I'm reminded of Eduardo Lorenzo's position that the Lusíadas do not construct identity, which comes from centuries of Portuguese history, but image. And while the popularity of Bushnell's novel has faded, I do admire his point of attack, which seems to have been looking to great texts in the hopes of at least partially reconciling a troubled history. And I will leave it there. I have some of the sources I mentioned here, Bastos' article, as well as a few other sources. So thank you very much. Muito obrigado. Mahalo nui loa. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Ben. It was fascinating and wonderful, wonderful comparative sources, and indeed very, very interesting. And so you took when you said at the beginning that you were native of Hawaii, correct?
I was born in Hawaii.
You were born there. Ah, interesting. Yeah, very, very well. And so were there strong, so you were born there and raised there, or just born there, and did you live there a while?
Well, thank you, Professor DeMatos, for the comment. Yeah, I grew up on the east side of Oahu, playing soccer at Sousa's.
So there were some Portuguese references along the way, especially the malasadas, of course, but
yeah, for sure. There was a Leonard's, like a Leonard's food truck
sure,
on the corner near the house, for sure. And then attended high school in Honolulu, and wound up living in South America for a long time, and spending time in São Paulo and Bahia, and then eventually now getting around to doing my PhD. So,
oh, fantastic.
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah.
And gonna head back to Brazil maybe, or no? Just
I hope. I don't know to what extent, but certainly I'll be back there.
Sure, sure. Fantastic. Well, wonderful presentation. Greatly done. I'd love to, it's too bad we don't have, it wasn't possible to do it in person at Fresno State. That would have been nice. And hopefully we can bring you and Andre as a team to Fresno State when we get back into some normality after the pandemic. That'd be awesome. That would be good. I think there's a question here, or just is it? Yeah.
Oh yeah. Professor DeMatos is asking. Oh, my focus is on Mario de Andrade, the São Paulo poet, in a comparative context.
Okay.
Yeah. While at the same time trying to cultivate this project is kind of a labor of love, as they say.
Right. Wonderful.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much. We appreciate it very, very much. Thank you for sharing it with us, and hope as you continue, of course, we can have you and Andre at Fresno State in person. That's something that we'd love to do. So thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me here.
Thank you. Thank you. And thanks to all of you for joining us. We're going to continue this session of the Luso-American Education Foundation Conference. As we had mentioned, we do have a presentation coming to us from Portugal, from the archipelago of the Azores. And so that will be our second part, but we appreciate the presentation by Ben very, very much. And so I'm going to share my screen here for those of you continuing on with us to the Azores, where a project was done a few months ago that we wanted to focus on this conference of the Luso-American Education Foundation, which was built upon poetry, and talking a little bit about the Azorean immigration as far as the Azores, and I should say the role of immigration in Azorean poetry. So indeed, and for those of you who've been with us since this morning, when we had the presentation this morning about Azores 2027, about having the city of Ponta Delgada as quite possible the cultural capital for Europe for 2017. That is something, of course, that we are hoping that, of course, will happen. And it is a project that involves the diaspora. And we're very fortunate that they indeed have done that, to involve the diaspora in this project. And so we figured that today, here on this second to last day of the Luso American Education Foundation Conference, we would share with you this one project that's called Açores de Mil Ilhas. And it was a project of the Associação dos Imigrantes dos Açores. PBBI had the good fortune of participating in this project, and we had quite a few Portuguese Azorian voices from this side of the Atlantic, thanks to Rui Faria, the director of the Association of the Azorian Immigrants in the city, in the island of São Miguel. We will actually be part of our panel tomorrow morning here on the last day of the Luso American Education Foundation Conference. And so we are going to actually share this presentation with you. So it's a different way to focus on the Azorian immigration through poetry. It is in Portuguese, and hopefully you will enjoy it as much as all of these people enjoyed and hard work putting it together. And again, it's had its debut during International Poetry Day in March. A big thank you to Rui Faria of the Azorian Immigrants Association for putting this project together and bringing the diaspora into a forefront in the Azores. So I will turn now to Portuguese for a quick intro. É com muito gosto que neste congresso da Luso American Education Foundation, que é organizado pelo Instituto Português Além Fronteiras, Portuguese Beyond Borders Institute, que temos este projeto, um documentário que foi feito pela Associação dos Imigrantes dos Açores, o Dr. Rui Faria, e este projeto que foi lançado em março deste ano, portanto, por ocasião do Dia Internacional da Poesia. É a imigração dos Açores na poesia açoriana, baseada na antologia Nem Sempre a Saudade Chora, um trabalho muito interessante, feito, como eu disse, pela Associação dos Imigrantes dos Açores, feito pelo nosso amigo Rui Faria, que é um jovem dinâmico da ilha de São Miguel, muito dedicado, obviamente, às causas da imigração, às causas da nossa diáspora e ao estreitar dos laços entre a diáspora e o arquipélago dos Açores. Vou, portanto, partilhar-vos este documentário, este vídeo, que é de cerca de pouco menos de meia hora, que será a segunda e última parte desta sessão, esta 8ª sessão do Congresso da Luso American Education Foundation. Hope all of you enjoy it.
Escrevo-te esta carta para saber como vais passando. A saudade é que nos farta, mas por cá vamos andando muito bem, graças a Deus. Nestas linhas que alinhava muito mal, desejo aos teus também saúde. Por mim cá...
A vida nas ilhas, em qualquer uma das 9, era difícil. Uma vida de subsistência básica, alicerçada em longas horas de trabalho, de manhã à noite, com poucos benefícios para a vasta maioria dos açorianos. Daí a nossa partida para outras latitudes. O sonho do novo mundo chegou cedo aos Açores. Primeiro com o Brasil e mais tarde com a América do Norte, os Estados Unidos, o Canadá, as Bermudas. A imigração aconteceu, com ela uma explosão contínua do vulcão da saudade.
Sou desta ilha, sou uma de tantas. Pedra, vulcão de saudade, ilha de lava a queimar amor. corpo de gente, rubro de liberdade. Sou desta ilha, que é arco-íris, rasgando o céu da águia escura, que é a cor de tantas e me faz feliz, e imagina o mar em névoas de longura. Sou desta ilha, feita de mil vozes, toadas de calor, sol de lá, sem dó. No sol maior da sua ternura, gritando silêncios numa voz só. Sou desta ilha, décima de rimas, de poetas loucos, língua inventada. Navega serena em marés de espuma, minha ilha, mátria reencontrada.
Desta hora a mão na pena, poucas letras e saberes. Tua carta tão pequena que nos fala em teus haveres. Cá fiquei o teu vazio, em manhã de cravos goivos. Lembro-me que o ar estava frio, Rosa e Manuel estavam neves. E a saudade se quedou como caldo na tigela, no coração que estralou como vidro na janela.
A mala da nossa imigração levava, sobretudo, muita esperança. Eram partidas com raríssimos retornos. Levavam, como nos diz um dos poemas emblemáticos da nossa saudade, que nem sempre chora, a raiva na barriga. Partia-se com pouco, muitos com a dívida da passagem e o desejo de se voltar um dia. Regresso que raramente aconteceu, e quando aconteceu, nem sempre foi um retorno verdadeiro. Na imigração, pelo menos nos primeiros tempos, vivia-se entre duas pontes, sem na realidade pertencermos-nos a nenhum dos dois lados.
Leva telegas de sol em todas as algebeiras, mil esperanças nem só rol, liberdades cavaleiras. Leva fortuna talhadas, lindas visões no olhar, no palma da mão fechadas, ilusões para o guiar. Leva moldes do seu gosto, frutos da sua invenção, lágrimas pressas no rosto, saudades no coração. Leva os olhos no mover, as saudades a rezar, um par de lábios a rir, o coração a sagrar. E num saco a tiracolo, leva a terra que deixou, leva a seiva desse solo, que há poucos dias lavrou. Parte sem saber se chega, chega sem saber se estar. Quando a estar já não sossega cá nem lá.
Mas juntaste pé de meia, já tens um bom bocado. Isso é terra de mão cheia, te leigo bem aviado. Gostei de saber que tens frisa e um novo mexim, sofas, clausetas, sertões e alvarozes de ingrém. Já sei que tens fogão, uma trela e talaveja, e que já vives no tão, mas que sorte salve seja.
Nós sabemos como a imigração constitui um dos acontecimentos centrais da história açoriana, pela sua duração, pelo seu prolongamento no tempo, mas também pelas consequências e as implicações económicas, sociais, culturais que teve na sociedade açoriana. Isto é, do ponto de vista artístico, se quisermos, isso é de tal maneira óbvio que a literatura açoriana, desde os seus primórdios no século XIX, teve o cuidado de representar algumas das situações envolvendo a imigração, representá-las literariamente, por vezes de uma forma muito idealizada, portanto, a pensar na América como uma espécie de território onde os dólares caíam do céu sem esforço. Em termos de representação pictórica, se quisermos chamar-lhe assim, um dos objetos mais emblemáticos da imigração é efetivamente o quadro do Domingos Rebelo, Os Imigrantes. É uma cena de despedida no cais, rumo a oeste, obviamente, com o seu lado doloroso e emotivo que é o da despedida, mas também com alguns aspectos sobre os quais nós podemos pensar que dizem respeito à representação de alguma cultura açoriana, alguns elementos da cultura açoriana que lá estão preparados para acompanhar as pessoas que imigram. O quadro do Domingos Rebelo, hoje, não pode deixar de articular-se com outra representação pictórica, que é os regressantes do Tomás Vieira. Trata-se da outra faceta, do outro momento da imigração, que é o regresso, um regresso já num outro tempo insular, mas também um regresso com outras formas culturais que são já da adaptação e do contato das pessoas com um outro mundo. O quadro do Tomás Borba Vieira é restrito a um regresso de pessoas, mas nós podemos também, nesta perspectiva de retorno e de regresso e de enriquecimento e de variedade ou de variação cultural, podemos pensar também nos contributos que chegaram do outro espaço, do espaço americano, a nível de alguma arquitetura açoriana, a nível também de alguma música popular, que foi trazida e depois adaptada, e tudo isso são, digamos, fatores, são aspectos que se articulam intimamente com a experiência da imigração nas suas diferentes facetas, nas suas diferentes implicações.
Estaria ausente o pintor quando no cais antigo as mulheres desembarcavam, os maridos, os baús e as crianças? Talvez não sabíamos, nunca, mas alguém nos dirá o que olham estes hoje distantes e perdidos. Mas montes de partidos, janelas de ponta delgada, que horizontes vos não fixam e vos negam. De certo, eu seguro quase apenas a demora do gesto em suspensão, a quietude prolongante e inevitável partida pressentida. Já nos objetos que, fragmentando-se da tela, se assustam, se desagregam, destroços, pois, os resíduos com que almas e corpos se alinhavam e costuram. Matéria demais para a exígua saca de retalhos anterior a circunstanciais, modismos de patchwork. Oh, como estes nomes desmoneiam a pensada emoção das coisas. Mas se não estava ausente o pintor, já por certo se repartia o corpo entre a ia e a viagem. Metáfora por ele inscrita nos inversos corações sobre a viola que não tocará esta mulher sentada e fixando-nos para lá do laço e do silêncio. Só ela dirá da solidão a que o pintor se rendia, quando, no fim dos trabalhos, do porto se apartava e da tela. Alguns nomes de circunstância.
E que uma pisca de dólares te vestiste numa estua, isso que é Bruno e Violas, nem Fidalgo de Lisboa. Tu te parece um engano, quase choro de contente. Que terra é essa, mano, que tão te dá de repente? Quando estiveres de banda, e se isto puder ser, tira retratos e manda, que a gente gosta de ver.
Até meados do século XX, os Estados Unidos tinham uma atitude de que os imigrantes que vinham para cá tinham que esquecer o seu país e as suas tradições, e vinham para cá começar uma vida nova, e um dos bons sinais de marcar essa mudança era americanizar os nomes. Eles vinham para cá, era para ser americanos, não era para manterem as tradições nem a sua língua, etc. E, portanto, havia preocupação, os funcionários, ao chegar os imigrantes, muitas vezes faziam isso lá, outras vezes era quando os imigrantes adquiriam a cidadania americana. Havia funcionários que tinham umas listas com os nomes equivalentes. Alguns eram já por acumulação, por tradição. Outros procuravam na altura se era um nome novo, se não estava na lista. Muitas vezes era apenas por semelhança. Foi assim que Machado deu Marshall, Ávila deu Avalon, Pereira, Perry, Bernardo, Bennett, Correia, Curry, Faria, Ferry, Mendonça, Meadow, e Coelho, mais próximo em inglês, Quail. Muitas vezes era por tradução. Havia a palavra por tradução, às vezes apenas aproximada. Como em Carvalho, está bem, Oak, Ferreira, Smith, Câmara, Chambers, Silveira, Green, Neves, Snow, Alves, White, Madeira, Wood. Há histórias muitas, e algumas das minhas favoritas são um professor na Brand chamado Horace Martin, E era Horácio Martins, veio da Ribeira Grande com 10 anos e pensou, eu com o nome português toda a gente lhe dizia não iria a lado nenhum, teve que americanizar o nome e arranjou só com uma leve mudança, Horácio para Horace, Martins para Martin, e o nome soa americaníssimo. É um caso interessante nas Flores, de uma família que era o último nome Duarte. A família foi para a Califórnia, lá americanizou o nome para Edwards, depois regressou aos Açores e voltou ao português, mas em vez de mudar para Duarte, que era o original, mudou para Eduardo. Ora, Eduardo é um primeiro nome. E assim temos nas Flores uma família que tem por último nome um primeiro nome por causa dessa volta. Há um bispo em Oregon chamado Levada. Nós lemos em português, mas em inglês eles dizem Leveira. Leveira foi a transcrição fonética do nome Oliveira. Leveira, Leveira, e ficou em inglês Levada para nós, para eles Leveira. Há um nome que eu também acho muito interessante, que é um D-E-S-A. Pronuncia-se Dissa. Era de Sá. Os americanos têm o hábito de juntar o de, fazer com o último nome, de Souza, de Sá. Não usavam a acentuação, as máquinas não tinham, e depois, quando juntaram, o S passou para minúsculo, o S maiúsculo passou para minúsculo, e ficou Dissa. E a minha favorita é muitas famílias aqui, chamadas Inos, e eu pensava que fosse uma deturpação do nome português Enes, mas eles eram São Miguel, não há Enes em São Miguel, não havia na altura, e então andei às voltas, e a história é muito comprida, mas para torná-la curta, afinal, o Inos, escrito Enos, pronuncia-se Inos. Inos não é mais do que a transcrição fonética. O funcionário ouviu pronunciar Inácio à moda miquelense, Inos. E ele escreveu Inos, E-N-O-S. Muitas vezes na autoestrada vou a conduzir e vejo umas carrinhas de uma empresa, Enos. Mas em inglês é empresa, toda a gente conhece a empresa por a empresa Inos. E ninguém, não passa pela cabeça a ninguém pensar que esse nome vem de uma família, de famílias miquelenses que têm como último nome Inácio.
Passaram-se milhas, ficaram as ilhas, tão longe para lá. E a gente que veio ficou e por meio, nem além nem cá. É outra esta terra, é outra esta gente. E o Joe, que era Zé, lá dentro até sente que agora já é nas ilhas ausente. Mas sabe também que ainda não tem aqui o seu pé seguro e assente. Ausente, presente, quer cá como lá. Há quem, como além, ao meio partido. O Joe, que era Zé, não sabe se até, assim dividido, é 1, 2 ou 3, João ou Janine 2, se Frank ou Francisco, e ignora outra vez que a culpa, enfim, é só do Monim do Corisco.
Vocês e essas grandes vistas, coloridas, um consolo. Mesmo que mexindo as fitas, anda lá, não sejas tolo. E antes que me esqueça, tu diz-me se vens croar para o verão. Não aconteça depois não teres lugar nos butos do Espírito Santo. Os pieiros estão dados e eu preciso saber quanto dás pelos bezerros mercados.
Pois nós já não conseguimos viver sem os nossos imigrantes, seja na festa, na romaria, nos dias dos batizados, casamentos. Eles, quando chegam, deixam a sua marca. Não se pode dizer que é uma cultura de imigrante. Há quem lhe chame os calafonas. Está no dicionário e vem da palavra Califórnia. Eu não costumo usar esse termo, porque às vezes pode parecer depreciativo. Agora, é verdade que há uma assunção por parte dos nossos imigrantes que foram à procura de melhores oportunidades e que chegaram à América, ao Canadá, mas sobretudo à América, e foram trabalhar e ganharam algumas posses e, portanto, quando regressam, vêm com saudades de um tempo perdido. E quando chegam, já não são bem aquilo, ao fim de muitos anos, já não são aquilo que deixaram, já não são aquilo que pensam que eram, mas também já não são uns americanos modernos, ricos. Agora são pessoas com posses. E então trazem esses elementos na cor, no vestuário, no sentido de que estão melhor de quando foram da ilha. E trazem então os símbolos, pode ser através dos ouros, a quantidade de ouros, pode ser nos anéis com as bandeiras da América e de Portugal, com os Açores, mas não querem só um símbolo, querem muitos. Na roupa que trazem, que compram, nas malas, no seu chapéu, na toda a alegria colorida, porque é uma forma de identidade também, dizer eu sou americano. E quando chegam, trazem também um sentido muito próprio da religiosidade que deixaram atrás. A saudade, a religiosidade, e por isso transportam para o seu corpo muitos cordões com a medalha em ouro, se possível, ou em prata, do seu Santo Cristo, Nossa Senhora de Fátima, Nossa Senhora de Lourdes, enfim, das santas das suas terras. É uma forma de dizer, nós voltámos e estamos melhor. Trazemos uma América própria. E trazem isso nas cantigas, nos cantores, que também têm uma forma de estar, porque gostam de escrever as suas próprias letras, nem sempre o melhor poema, mas trazem as melodias, normalmente com muito ritmo, para se divertirem, e às vezes um bocadinho lamechas, porque vão buscar a saudade do berço, da avó, da mãe. Há muitas cantigas ligadas a esse ritual de uma saudade perdida, da igrejinha, da aldeia. São palavras que aparecem muito no ritual das suas manifestações de alegria. E também vemos isso nos jantares. Quando uns jantares de imigrantes gostam de oferecer à família, normalmente são jantares com muita gente e normalmente quem paga é quem veio da América. É o jantar do tio, do primo da América. Quem é que não gosta desta gente, desses nossos açorianos que, estando lá, nunca deixaram de estar cá. E estando cá, estão lá, mas com as suas próprias, os seus próprios símbolos e também dentro de uma comunidade muito ativa e muito viva, sempre com a recordação dos Açores. Chamem-lhe o que quiserem, mas uma terra e uma festa sem os nossos imigrantes não é a mesma coisa.
És mais um americano acabado de chegar, dessa América distante, onde esteve a trabalhar. Vem obeso corpulente, rechonchudo de bela cor, bem vestido e bem calçado. Dizem elas um amor. Na cabeça chapéu mole, com peninha de pavão, um relógio todo de ouro. Já tem ares de patrão. Dá à igreja da paróquia alguns dólares para o culto. Não se sabe quantos foram, mas foi dádiva de vulto. A tourada ele pagou, assim disse todo o fono. Pagará a nova tourada, se voltar cá para o ano. Eu ali em plena rua, conversando com os contos, a quem fala das Américas, seu loiro e seus encantos. Breve parte para Boston. Vai de novo trabalhar. Quer ganhar mais uns milhares, para depois se fixar. Assim mesmo é que se faz. O que dá a Nova Inglaterra, os Açores é que se investe. Para bem da nossa terra.
Com certeza queres tudo abundância. Sopas e carne na mesa e música na briança. Só o gosto da salvação vocês viram este ano. E termos o coração em casa um americano. A saca de encomendas com as roupas que não usa já está. Não há emendas, nem nas calças nem nas blusas.
Quando o visto e os bilhetes estavam assegurados para a partida dos Açores para a nova terra, começava o doloroso processo da despedida dos amigos, irmãos, pais e até do seu amor. Em localidades pequenas, açorianas, quando haviam grandes grupos de famílias que iriam partir no mesmo dia para a imigração, era comum haver missas com o padre a desejar boa sorte e que a fé continua a acompanhar aqueles que tinham de partir à procura de melhores oportunidades. A última noite antes da partida era de ansiedade e de várias dúvidas se algum dia iriam ver novamente a sua terra. E chegava o dia em que se juntavam no cais ou no aeroporto para um último adeus e aí sentiam que era mesmo real e iriam viver uma outra vida a milhares de quilómetros, longe do regaço da mãe e amparo do pai. Adeus Açores. Olá, Esperança.
Já chegou à nossa terra o vapor que vai levar para a América do Norte o Guilherme da Guiomar. Na manhã em que ele foi, a Guiomar metia a dó. Para o filho ela gritava, não me deixes ficar só. Fora antes à capela do seu bairro, o Corpo Santo, e rezar assim à Virgem, sempre a desfazer-se em pranto. Tomai conta do meu filho. Vosso filho ela também. Defendei a Virgem Santa, já que seja sua mãe. Foi em Angra, casa alfândega, quase à hora da partida. Mãe e filha abraçadinhos, oh que triste despedida. Meu Guilherme, escuta bem o que te vou dizer. Sabes tu que é um filho? É alguém que a mãe adora. E entre todas as mulheres, nunca encontrarás ninguém a quem deves mais amor do que à tua própria mãe. Se souberes lá na América que eu morri, cheguei ao fim, reza muito por minha alma. Filha, lembra-te de mim. Adeus, filho da minha alma, meu Guilherme, meu amor. Seja feliz e boa viagem. Vá com Deus, Nosso Senhor. A Guiomar passou a noite a chorar no duro leito, como se ela ainda estivesse estreitando o filho ao peito.
E dizias que mandavas não por ser de coisas raras, que eram roupas muito usadas, afinal, boas e caras. Fica tudo como um preco e cá dá-nos muito jeito. Precisa apenas de um repreco nos alvaroços de peito. A roupa poliéster fica mesmo um assento. Domingo de nossa festa farei grão de luzimento.
A criação de uma freguesia açoriana rodeada de América por todos os lados, como escreveu Onésimo Almeida, foi a forma dos imigrantes sobreviverem à estranheza das novas terras, de diversas culturas, de outras vivências. A Grande América entrava-nos diariamente no nosso pequeno mundo e havia a necessidade de se conceber um espaço unicamente nosso, imune às ditas porquidades da Grande América. As festas e o nosso movimento associativo, aliado aos jornais e à rádio em língua portuguesa, foram o porto seguro da geração imigrante, que apesar de querer integrar, de querer ser americano, canadiano ou brasileiro, não podia abdicar do espaço ilhéu. Daí a criação de muitas ilhas de bruma no seio dos continentes americanos.
Fala-me de muitas coisas. Manda-me um abraço grande como o seu coração. E conta-me sobretudo coisas que não se contam. Sua carta diz-me pura e rica como sua voz. De mexins para um tudo de estoas e de tãs, do Chinatown à noite e de Francoçoisa nas festas de Gastinhas. Que o Val de São Francisco é um céu encanado. Conta-me de brigas, notícias de Nova York, que veio na televeja, os papéis troiveram de fitas faladas que viu em americano, acidentes no freeway, xarefas, leitarias, e diz que na América o passadio é outro. E fala-me ainda de muitas porquidades por aquela América, sem pontos, sem vírgulas e jamais acento em sua aventura. Joe Simas, San Francisco Valley, Vale de São Francisco, onde não há paredes, e o sonho ribomba pela campina fora. Sua carta conta-me coisas que só visto, e com a amizade termina com bolinhas e cruzes.
E as severas para os pequenos também estão a desbancar. Estão grudinhos e moranos, cabritinhos a saltar. Mas quem vai ficar caipora é Maria, a minha dona, com vestido de senhora nem borrinha de atafona. Seja pela vossa saúde, tanta abundância nos dais. Que Deus sempre vos ajude e de par cada vez mais.
The poet Eduardo Betancourt Pinto wrote, "One can be born on an island in two ways, from the body of a woman or from the radiance of sensibility." This radiance of sensibility struck a chord with me as I began to research my Azorian heritage. Many of us have diasporic and ancestral ties that bind us to the islands in tangible and passionate ways. Two of my maternal great-grandparents emigrated from the Azores in 1906, and I've been able to trace my family roots on the island of San Miguel to some of the early settlers. My grandfather, their son, was born in America. He wanted to be American, like many first-generation sons and daughters of immigrants. He didn't participate much in the Azorian community, the festas, or any of the traditions. So my Azorian heritage was always kind of a shadow in the corner of the room, beckoning me to explore it. When I finally had the opportunity to do so, I found a rich heritage. I found a deepening connection that I felt personally to the islands, to the sensibility. I started to explore Azorian poetry, both the great Azorian poets from history, but also some of my contemporaries, mostly in English translations, but also increasingly in Portuguese. And I started to explore this radiance of sensibility, this sense of connection in my own work, specifically Azorian Suite. And I found that connection Even though I'm third generation, barely 1/4 Azorean Portuguese, that connection is real and tangible, and I feel it every day, deepening, pulling me back towards the islands.
Maria, estimarei tua saudade e destejo, pois a nossa a fazer desta é boa, graças a Deus. Depois que daqui saíste, nunca mais houve alegria. Começada a nossa vida, veio a noite e fez o dia. Saudade é como o luar, que só a noite é que brilha. O mundo que por ti chora, nem tu sabes, minha filha. A dor em que teu pai vive, basta olhar para o rosto. Envelhecer. Nunca mais para nada teve gosto. O craveiro do balcão já se secou, que te dei. Faltou-lhe a luz dos teus olhos e o modo do teu carinho. A tua cadeira baixa, lá está junto à janela, como quem ainda espera que tu venhas sentar nela.
Nessa terra de grandeza, agora as novidades. São as mesmas da tristeza, do levantar às trindades. O primeiro entristeceu e que já dorme no chão, feitija quem, que morreu, com malzinho de coração. A galanta já pariu, uma bezerra amarela. O trefo, por morto frio, queimou-se que nem morcela.
A imigração em termos de grande êxito terminou, pelo menos assim nos dizem os números. Hoje os açorianos têm outras oportunidades, dentro do arquipélago e no seio da grande Europa. Porém temos e teremos sempre os primos da América. Parte do coração açoriano vive no outro lado do Atlântico. A diáspora que todos queremos criar terá uma saudade diferente. A saudade que nem sempre chora. Os Açores são mais Açores com a sua diáspora. A imigração tocou profundamente quem partiu, mas também quem ficou. Um arquipélago integrado na Europa moderna, com um imaginário profundamente marcado pelas Américas e pelas Califórnias perdidas de abundância, como escreveu o poeta Pedro da Silveira. Na realidade, com a nossa diáspora, para os açorianos, a América estará sempre logo ali.
Todas as vezes que regresso ao lugar onde nasci, sinto descolorida e feia aquela terra. E nem no mar a salva, nem na minha pele onde se inscrevem nomes e tempo. Nada. É uma culpa como o aleluia. De todas as vezes que dela me aparto, admito que, apesar de monótona, é nela que se renova a medula do espírito. É de uma beleza sem consolo. Sempre que regresso, as mulheres de negro emocionam-me. E quando parto, elas vêm lembrar que as árvores não morreram. Sempre voltarei ao lugar onde nasci. Mesmo que as velhas tenham morrido, sejam outras as árvores, ou da casa de meus pais não se veja mais o mar. Sou eu a decidir. É esse o consolo maior, e é esse o modo de me redimir.
E já se secou tão bem a figueira das carelas. Nossa casa agora tem tinta verde nas janelas. De resto, por cada dia trabalho vergado ao chão. Mesmo a raiva na barriga, mesmo vazio na mão. Que aqui em cada ano somos sempre menos gente.
Que terra é esta, mano? Que nada dá de repente. Tantas vezes já picado fui na alma e no corpo, que se me dando danado cairei por terra morta. Vem barulho da cozinha, mais moço bate prato. Dá malinho nem doninha, então levou um sopapo. E agora, se me ouves, termino. Vamos cear o mesmo caldo de couves, do almoço e do jantar. Tira os erros destas linhas. Minha escola foi a enxada. Não dá grandes ladainhas. Bem muito. Melhor do que nada. E já me chama a Maria. Eu estou no meio da casa. Enfim, até qualquer dia tenho um sono que me arrasa. Bom, saudades para os teus, dos vizinhos e da gente, um abraço e um adeus. Teu irmão, João Valente.
E assim estivemos com esta apresentação que nos veio desde o arquipélago dos Açores, da Associação dos Imigrantes dos Açores, como parte deste congresso da Luso-American Education Foundation, nesta que foi a nossa 8ª sessão. Portanto, começamos na quarta-feira pela manhã, com uma sessão das 9 até ao 12h15, outra das 2 às 4 da tarde e outra das 5 às 6h45. Ontem repetimos a mesma dose, ou seja, das 9 até às 12h15, depois tivemos outra das 2 até às 4 e pela tarde, ao fim da tarde, entre as 5 e as 6h30. E hoje tivemos a sessão da manhã, desde as 9 também, até por volta um pouco depois do meio-dia, aliás foi até cerca das 12h30, e esta sessão agora que começou às 2 horas e que termina em breves instantes, mas entretanto voltaremos a estar convosco para a 9ª sessão do Congresso da Luso-American Education Foundation, que será daqui a pouco, será pelas 5 horas da tarde, hora da Califórnia, mais 3 na costa leste dos Estados Unidos da América, será em inglês e terá o tema da criatividade na diáspora portuguesa aqui na América do Norte. Portanto, leituras e também alguma conversa em colaboração com o Colóquio Cagarro e obviamente que incluirá vários escritores e poetas. E depois tudo continuará amanhã, no que será o último dia do Congresso da Luso-American Education Foundation, com uma sessão começando às 9 da manhã, a diáspora portuguesa na América do Norte, perspectivas da Terra-mãe, com Jorge Betancourt, Aida Batista, Rui Faria, Célia Carmen Cordeiro e Maria Isabel Camacho Santos. Pelas 10h30, em inglês, Beyond Saudade, Our Heritage, Identities and Outlooks, com Joshua Benedetti, Sabrina Brum, Andrew Figueiredo e Stephanie Ali. E pelo meio-dia, um projeto que será sobre a aprendizagem de línguas, the California World Language Standards and Framework, Social Justice in the Proficiency Focused Language Classroom, e terá a moderação do professor doutor, nosso amigo Duarte Silva, e com a presença de Svetlana Lazarova, que foi a coautora, uma das coautoras do World Language Framework for California Public Schools para o ano de 2020 e que é professora de latim. Esta sessão durará cerca também de 1h30 a 1h45, seguindo-se da Portuguese Hispanic Family Inclusion Realities and Possibilities, o diálogo com um jovem que foi criado com as 3 culturas, a cultura portuguesa, a cultura hispânica e, obviamente, a presença americana. E depois, pelas 3 horas da tarde, teremos a sessão de encerramento, que será presidida pelo Sr. Diretor Regional das Comunidades do Arquipélago dos Açores, Dr. José Andrade, e incluirá, obviamente, a representação da Luso-American Education Foundation. Portanto, até daqui a cerca de 1h30 para a nona sessão, e brevemente em inglês. Thank you all for joining us. We'll be back in about 90 minutes at 5 p.m. with Creativity in the Portuguese Diaspora in North America, readings and discussions. This is in collaboration with the Cagarro Colloquium and part of the United Through Heritage campaign. And it will feature the poets and writers Kelly Câmara, Lara Goulart, Paula Neves, Melinda Medeiros, Melissa Jessenheiser, Sam Pereira, and Scott Edward Anderson. That's going to be at 5 p.m. this evening, Pacific Daylight Time, 8 p.m. on the East Coast. And tomorrow, our last day of the conference, our fourth and last day of the conference, will begin at 9 o'clock in the morning, and we will end it with the closing ceremonies, which will be at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. There's a session at 9 o'clock in the morning in Portuguese with perspectives from the motherland about the diaspora. There's a session at 10:30 in English, Beyond Saudade, Our Heritages, Identities, and Outlooks, with young Portuguese Americans who have roots in Portugal. Josh Benedetti, Sabrina Broom, Andrew Figueiredo, and Stephanie Ali. And then at 12 o'clock, the California World Language Standards and Framework. Something very, very important, certainly for the teaching of the Portuguese language at all levels, community schools, all the way up to colleges, social justice in the proficiency-focused language classroom. This will be moderated by Professor Duarte Silva, and the presenter is Svetlana Lazarova, who is one of the co-authors of the World Language Framework for California Public Schools. And at 1:30, the Portuguese Hispanic Family, Inclusion, Realities, and Possibilities, where we'll have a fascinating conversation with a young man who now lives in the Washington, D.C. area, here from California, an original Californian, but who was brought up in a home that was trilingual, 3 languages, 3 cultures, and the inclusion, a modern day Portuguese Hispanic family. And then we will end everything around 3 o'clock in the afternoon with our closing ceremonies. And throughout the day, we'll also have some musical segments to continue to pay tribute to those in the Portuguese American world and their creativity. So stick around with us. So we'll be back at 5 o'clock with our last session for this evening. And then we will have all day tomorrow as well. It is the Luso American Education Foundation Conference. Thanks to all of you who are here on Zoom. Thanks to all of you who have been part of the Luso American Education Foundation Conference throughout the last 45 years. And certainly to those who have been part of this joint venture with PBBI from Fresno State, not only this year, but also last year as well. Fresno State has hosted the conference in the past as well, a couple of times before this year of 2021 and last year of 2020. We hosted the conference in 2018 in collaboration with Tulare Joint Union High School District. And 3 years earlier, we had also done a youth session there at Fresno State. So we will be back at 5 o'clock. Thank you all for following us as well on social media. Hope you are with us at 5 p.m. for Creativity in the Diaspora, in the Portuguese diaspora in North America. This is the 45th conference of the Luso American Education Foundation, hosted by the Portuguese Beyond Borders Institute at Fresno State. And we want to thank all of the different folks who are with us, and especially, of course, a huge thanks to João Manuel Dias and Televisão Portuguesa da Califórnia for live streaming the event. We're also on this Zoom platform and on Facebook Live. Thanks to all the pages, all the groups who have agreed to carry it live as well. We'll be back at 5 o'clock. Enjoy and take a break and enjoy maybe a drink. It must be 5 o'clock somewhere. Take care.